Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we're going to have another video in our World War II history series, and this one is going to look at the history of internment camps, and specifically their use here in the United States during World War II. During World War II, Battleship New Jersey's crew was primarily Caucasian, almost exclusively American citizens. There were some recent immigrants who served on the ship's crew in order to get citizenship. There were some Americans from American colonies who were not explicitly American citizens but were serving on board. Almost the ship's entire crew was white. The entire crew was male. When we had non-white crew members, there were some Latinos on the crew. They could serve pretty freely in the different ranks, in the different enlisted ranks. And there were some African American and some Filipino crew members. However, there were no Japanese crew members on the ship. Or I should say Americans of Japanese descent. So if they weren't allowed in the Navy, where were they? They had lived in this country for generations by the time World War II started. The bulk of Japanese Americans, about 120,000 of them, primarily from the West Coast, were held in internment camps during World War II. Another term for internment camps is concentration camps. So let me take a minute and talk about that before we get on to more about the Japanese-American experience. Today we think of concentration camps as the extermination camps used by Nazi Germany during World War II. That was not the first use of concentration camps. And while Germany did have about a dozen extermination camps, that was a completely separate entity from their concentration camps. So, the modern origin of the concentration camp started in the 1860s and 70s when Spain was fighting essentially a civil war or a revolutionary war in Cuba. The Spanish were trying to suppress Cuban revolutionaries. And about 20 or 30 years later, these suppressions would lead to the Spanish-American War, in which the Cubans traded Spanish colonization for American colonization. But one of the tactics used during that war was the Spanish concentrated Cuban civilians into camps, and that way they could not leave those camps and fight. And Cuban revolutionaries did not have access to those people to recruit additional fighters. Concentration camps were again used during the Boer Wars in South Africa, where the British would concentrate Boer civilians. And they were used by the United States during the Philippine-American War. Following the Spanish-American War, Filipinos who had previously been colonized by the Spanish tried to revolt, and the United States fought a war to suppress that revolution and keep the Philippines, or establish the Philippines, as an American colony. And as part of that, they used concentration camps on certain ethnic groups in the Philippines. When we get up into the middle 20th century, you see concentration camps exist in the Soviet Union in the form of gulags, and in Nazi Germany, where they used concentration camps to concentrate their population of what the Nazi government deemed undesirable, primarily Jewish people, but also other ethnicities and groups. Gays, Romani, Gypsies, and mentally handicapped people. These concentration camps were initially to get all the people out of all of the undesirables out of the city and into specific concentrated areas where they could be starved and worked to death. But human beings proved to be incredibly resilient, and so they added extermination camps to the concentration camp network. And these were separate camps where people were sent specifically to be euthanized, exterminated. And that one, the name is pretty on the nose. As it is with concentration camps, it's just because we have this mentality of concentration camps equal what the Nazis do, we forget about all the other times concentration camps happen. Why do we think about it with what the Nazis did? The Germans did it to Germans. The world didn't care. The Germans started doing it to their neighbors, and we get a world war. The Soviets killed far more people in their concentration camps, gulags, over a much longer period of time, from about 1919 all the way up until 1991. But they were doing that to their own people, so there were no repercussions for that. Likewise, there were no repercussions for the United States, either with our Philippine American concentration camps around 1900 or the Japanese American internment camps. So, President Roosevelt put out an order, 9066, that meant that the military commanders, primarily along the West Coast, could set up military districts wherever they wanted, and they could forcibly relocate the civilian populations of these areas. So a lot of coastal California was designated as these military districts for coastal defense and military use. Makes sense. The Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor. There was worries that they were going to invade the West Coast. And so we started to do something very similar to what other countries did with creating coastal defenses along our coasts. In hindsight, we know that it was pretty unreasonable that the Japanese could reach us with any significant impact. While they had submarines bombard our coasts and could even send aircraft carriers as far as Alaska, there was never a significant threat to the U.S. West Coast. But the Pacific Fleet had just been destroyed at Pearl Harbor, so there was some concern that the Japanese could march right into San Francisco if they wanted. And so people were kicked out of their homes, and the people who lived in these areas were primarily fairly recent immigrants within 1 or 2 generations, and they tended to be of Japanese origin. This order was carried a step further, and when these roughly 120,000 people were removed from their homes there, they were moved to a series of internment camps, concentration camps, in the middle of the country, far away from other population centers, and they were forced to live in barracks structures, fairly uninsulated, fairly unappointed in terms of furniture, plumbing, other amenities that they would have had in their homes, and they weren't allowed to take much with them when they were forcibly relocated at gunpoint in the middle of the night. It wasn't necessarily in the middle of the night, but it was on very short notice. They were allowed to pack a bag or two, and then they were put on buses and trucked to the middle of the country, basically. This does happen to some German Americans and Italian Americans on the East Coast, but nowhere near the numbers that we see with Japanese Americans. Eventually, the internment case made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court specifically ruled that patriotic American citizens cannot be held without charges. And so the Japanese Americans who were interred were at that point given the chance to sign statements saying that they were patriotic American citizens, at which point they were given a little bit more freedom, and in some cases, if they had sponsors or met other criteria, they were allowed to be released back into the workforce. Many of these people spent 3 or 4 years in internment or concentration camps. So when these citizens returned to where their homes had been and their possessions had not been returned, they returned home with the same bag of clothes that they had taken to the concentration camp, and that's it, and they had to restart their lives again. So why was this done? Because anti-Japanese sentiment was rampant after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and because Japanese Americans looked different from the primarily Caucasian Americans running the country at that time. They were easy to single out. Why don't we see as many Germans and Italians go to the camps? They're much harder to identify, and they never surprise attacked us. Were German and Italian Americans allowed to serve in the Navy during World War II? Oh yeah. Adolf Hitler's nephew served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. So, was this racial prejudice justified? I don't think so, but I'm looking back at it from 80 years in the future. At the time, there was a belief that these individuals who were first or second generation or even more recent immigrants from Japan were going to form a fifth column and actively sabotage and cause other trouble for the United States. There was no evidence that any significant group of them was doing that, but you can argue that it's a reasonable fear, and that moving them away from what was considered a war zone, the coast of California, was justifiable. So the Navy didn't let Americans of Japanese descent serve, but the Army eventually did. By 1943, they had formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, comprised of, at any one time, about 4,000 Japanese Americans, which held all ranks and specialities. These men were more or less in a concentration camp of their own. They were all forced into a single unit. However, that unit's record is unmatched in the U.S. Army during World War II. Throughout the war, there were roughly 14,000 men who served in it, and they were given 18,000 awards. Some 4,000 Purple Hearts were earned by members of this unit, which is the entire strength of the force on paper. 21 Medals of Honor were awarded, more than any other regiment, and in just 2 years, they earned 8 Presidential Unit citations, 5 of them in a single month. Do you think they felt like they had something to prove? It worked. Following the war, President Truman desegregated the armed forces. Japanese Americans were allowed to serve in the Navy in all ranks and ratings, even as commissioned officers. In no war since has it been national policy to discriminate against Japanese Americans, nor to put American citizens in concentration camps. There's even a U.S. Navy ship today named after one of the members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, even though he served in the Army. Congressman Daniel Inouye lost his right arm fighting in Italy during World War II. He went on to serve in Congress for a couple of decades and was recognized by the U.S. Navy with the naming of an Arleigh Burke destroyer in his honor. Not bad for somebody who went from a concentration camp to not being allowed to serve in the Navy at all. Another famous American internee that you might have heard of is actor George Takei. You might recognize him from Star Trek, or John Wayne's Green Berets, or more recently, AMC's second season of The Terror, in which he relives his experience in these American concentration camps as an actor in the show and a consultant for them. The United States always does the right thing after expending all other options. During the Reagan administration, it was determined that any surviving internment camp detainees would be awarded a $20,000 reparation. That is vastly inadequate for losing basically 3 years of your life without committing any crimes, as well as your home, all of your belongings, and your career. But it's something. Perhaps the real takeaway here is that the country has since acknowledged that this was the wrong thing to do, and we have not since put Americans in concentration camps in this country. So this has been another World War II history video from us. Normally we talk about battles, but we do like to cover topics about the home front from time to time. Let us know if you know any Japanese Americans who were interned during the war. Tell us their stories in the comment section down below. In the description down below is a link to our GoFundMe campaign. If you like the museum and are interested in what we're doing here on the YouTube channel, it helps if you support us on there. We also receive support from the New Jersey Department of State. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you're notified when we put out new content. We do try to put out new stuff several times a week. And thanks for watching.